The last days of King Solomon, the sad end of the wisest king. Have you ever wondered how the wisest man on earth, the one who received unmatched wisdom from God, could end his life in sadness and spiritual decline? King Solomon, renowned for his discernment, understanding, and prosperity, built the temple of the Lord, authored timeless wisdom, and ruled over Israel with unmatched glory. Yet, despite all his blessings, his story ends with a caution that echoes through the ages. Even the most gifted, most blessed, and most enlightened can fall if their hearts drift from God. Today, I want you to see Solomon not just as a historical figure, but as a mirror for our own lives. A man who had everything yet faced the consequences of choices that pulled him away from intimacy with the Lord. Solomon's journey is filled with lessons of triumph and tragedy. He experienced unimaginable favor, glory, and divine wisdom, yet subtle compromises, distractions, and attachments eventually led to a spiritual decline that darkened the end of his life. This is not merely a story about a king from long ago. It is a story about the fragility of the human heart, the seductive power of comfort, and the importance of unwavering obedience to God. As we explore the last days of Solomon, we will uncover how pride, misplaced priorities, and spiritual neglect can slowly erode even the greatest of gifts. I want you to feel the weight of this story because it is as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. Solomon's life challenges us to examine our own hearts, our own decisions, and the areas where we may be drifting from God without even realizing it. There is hope in his story, but also a warning. Wisdom, wealth, and success cannot replace a heart fully devoted to Jesus. By looking closely at Solomon's rise and fall, we will gain insights that guide our faith, strengthen our commitment, and remind us that true wisdom is not measured by achievements but by a life aligned with God's will. Today, we will journey into the glory, the choices, the compromises, and the lessons of Solomon's final days. This is a story of brilliance shadowed by sorrow, of wisdom paired with human frailty, and of God's enduring call to his children. Remain faithful, guard your heart, and seek him above all. Are you ready to uncover the last days of the wisest king and the eternal truths his life reveals? Part 1. Solomon's Glory and Wisdom. Imagine a man whose wisdom was so extraordinary that kings and rulers from across the world traveled just to hear him speak, to witness his understanding, and to marvel at the depth of his insight. Solomon was that man. From the moment God granted him wisdom, his life became a beacon of divine favor. He could discern truth from falsehood, justice from deceit, and he made decisions that shaped the destiny of Israel for generations. But it wasn't just his ability to judge wisely that made him remarkable. It was his heart at that time, one fully seeking God, earnestly desiring to rule rightly and wanting to lead his people with integrity. The glory of Solomon's reign was visible everywhere. He built the magnificent temple, a house for the Lord that became the spiritual center of Israel. It was a place of worship, of divine presence, and a tangible symbol of God's covenant with his people. The entire nation thrived under his leadership. Wealth, peace, and prosperity flowed through the land. Solomon's wisdom guided him in creating alliances, managing resources, and understanding the hearts of those around him. He authored proverbs, songs, and reflections that revealed not just intelligence, but divine insight. People came from far and wide to witness his wisdom firsthand, to see how a man humble before God could operate with such discernment and understanding. Yet, even in his glory, Solomon's story reminds us of the fragility of the human heart. No matter how wise, how blessed, or how favored, a heart that is not continually aligned with God can become vulnerable. The early days of Solomon's reign were marked by humility and devotion. He prayed for wisdom rather than wealth or long life, demonstrating a heart attuned to divine purpose. This choice pleased God greatly, and it set the foundation for a period of unparalleled prosperity and influence. His wisdom was not just for judgment, but for understanding people, guiding a nation, and reflecting God's character in leadership. Despite the external success, Solomon's life also teaches us that glory and wisdom are not shields against spiritual decline. The same man who could discern right from wrong in judgment could still struggle with subtle shifts in his own heart. Early compromises, unnoticed attachments, and personal desires had the potential to quietly take root. The seeds of distraction or misalignment with God can start small, often hidden beneath the weight of responsibilities, successes, and even accolades. Solomon's story invites us to examine how easily wisdom and blessing can coexist with vulnerability, and how necessary it is to guard our hearts even in times of triumph. Solomon's wisdom also extended to relationships. He understood people, their motives, and their needs. His alliances, marriages, and political agreements were strategic and often divinely guided. But the very relationships that brought strength and stability also contained the potential for compromise. Solomon's story is a reminder that the people we align ourselves with, the counsel we follow, and the hearts we allow close to ours can shape our destiny in subtle but profound ways. He was the wisest man alive, yet even his heart could be influenced by the pressures, desires, and distractions that accompany power and prosperity. The glory of Solomon's reign, then, was not merely in the wealth or the temple he built, but in the reflection of God's wisdom in his leadership. His decisions, judgments, and writings were filled with insight and understanding beyond human capacity. People were inspired, nations were influenced, and the kingdom of Israel prospered as a testament to God's blessing. And yet, beneath the splendor and the wisdom, the story was only beginning to unfold. The very elements that brought glory, the wealth, the influence, the marriages, and even the power of wisdom would later become instruments of his spiritual challenge, testing the alignment of his heart with God's will. The life of Solomon in his glory reminds us that blessings are not guarantees of eternal security. They are opportunities, gifts to be stewarded with humility, wisdom, and ongoing devotion. Even the most extraordinary gifts, if mismanaged or accompanied by drifting faith, can lead to consequences that shadow the glory. Solomon's story in these years invites us to consider the importance of continual prayer, reflection, and alignment with God, recognizing that wisdom, prosperity, and divine favor are most powerful when they are paired with humility, obedience, and an unwavering heart. Part 2. The beginning of decline. Even the wisest can begin to drift. Solomon, whose early reign was marked by devotion, wisdom, and humility, gradually started to experience subtle shifts in his heart and priorities. It begins not with outright rebellion, but with small compromises, choices that seem reasonable at first, but slowly redirect the heart away from the unwavering focus on God. These early shifts are often easy to dismiss, cloaked in practicality, pleasure, or perceived necessity. In Solomon's case, they began with personal attachments and the increasing complexity of his kingdom. One of the first signs of decline was in his relationships. Solomon's marriages to foreign princesses were strategic, creating alliances that strengthened his political position and brought peace between nations. Yet these unions carried spiritual risk. His wives introduced practices and beliefs that conflicted with God's commandments, subtly influencing his priorities and his spiritual focus. While the wisdom of his judgments remained, the alignment of his heart with God's purpose began to face tension. This is a critical lesson. Even strategic, seemingly wise decisions can introduce compromise when they conflict with divine guidance. Solomon's heart also became burdened by the weight of his kingdom. Managing the affairs of a prosperous nation, building monumental projects, and maintaining peace and prosperity demanded attention, energy, and focus. The pressures of responsibility, even when guided by wisdom, can create space for distraction and drifting. Solomon's first compromises were likely invisible to most, even to himself, but they set the stage for deeper challenges. The heart, like soil, absorbs what it is exposed to. What begins subtly can grow into significant spiritual challenges over time. Another early sign of decline was an increasing attachment to material wealth and grandeur. Solomon's kingdom flourished, and he became known for his wealth, splendor, and accomplishments. While wealth itself is not sinful, the heart's response to abundance is crucial. Solomon began to enjoy the trappings of prosperity, the palaces, the treasures, the ceremonial rituals, which subtly shifted his focus from God to the resources and recognition of the world. These early attachments were like whispers in the spirit, gradually pulling his heart away from the simplicity of devotion he once cherished. Even his wisdom, which was a gift from God, became vulnerable to pride. Solomon, celebrated as the wisest man alive, began to experience the subtle intoxication of admiration, influence, and reputation. The accolades and respect of nations can create a sense of self-sufficiency, a belief that human insight is sufficient. The first cracks in Solomon's heart were not obvious in his decisions, but visible in the internal alignment of his priorities. He was capable of extraordinary judgment and insight, yet the heart that receives praise and recognition must continually return to humility before God. Political alliances, domestic pressures, and the complexity of ruling a nation compounded these subtle shifts. Even a man of wisdom is human. The intellect and discernment given by God can be overshadowed by personal desires, attachment to comfort, and the subtle pull of compromise. These early stages of decline are critical to recognize. They are quiet, insidious, and often unnoticed, yet they have profound consequences for the heart and for the legacy of leadership. The story of Solomon's early decline reminds us that wisdom, achievement, and devotion do not immunize the heart from drifting. Even the most enlightened, the most favored, and the most humble can face moments where the alignment of heart and purpose begins to shift. The first compromises, the subtle distractions, the attachments to people, power, and prosperity, all contribute to a spiritual tension that, if not addressed, can grow into deeper challenges. Solomon's story invites reflection on our own lives. Are we vigilant? Are our hearts aligned with God, even in the midst of blessing? Or are small compromises quietly eroding our devotion? This is the beginning of the sobering part of Solomon's story. The same man who prayed for wisdom, who sought to honor God, and who built a temple for his glory, began to experience internal tension, distractions, and subtle compromises. These early shifts were not catastrophic by themselves, but they signaled the start of a path that would eventually lead to the sadness and spiritual decline that marks the final days of his life. It is a reminder that even the wisest among us must guard our hearts, remain humble, and continually seek God's guidance in every aspect of life, relationships, and responsibility. Part 3. Idolatry and Spiritual Decline. As Solomon's reign progressed, the subtle shifts in his heart began to deepen into spiritual compromise. The very wisdom and insight that had guided him in judgment, governance, and leadership were now challenged by attachments and influences that slowly drew his heart away from God. One of the most significant turning points in Solomon's decline was his drift into idolatry, influenced by his foreign wives, political alliances, and the increasing complexity of his life. The heart that once sought God above all began to entertain distractions and desires that opposed God's commandments. Solomon's marriages, though initially strategic, became spiritual entanglements. His wives introduced practices and idols from their homelands, and he permitted altars, shrines, and rituals that were contrary to the commands of the Lord. These acts were gradual, subtle, and seemingly harmless in the eyes of men, but they represented a profound shift in spiritual alignment. The first cracks of compromise had widened into patterns that drew Solomon away from the intimacy he once enjoyed with God. The heart, once devoted and humble, was now divided, showing how even wisdom cannot fully protect against spiritual drift when desires and attachments override obedience. The The spiritual decline of Solomon was also a reflection of the human tendency to trust in personal insight and achievements rather than in God. He had built the temple, accumulated wealth, authored proverbs, and ruled with unparalleled wisdom, yet the very blessings meant to honor God became temptations to elevate himself, to rely on his own understanding, and to allow pride to infiltrate his heart. Even the wisest can be tempted to replace dependence on God with dependence on human abilities and worldly accomplishments. The idolatry was not merely external, it was an internal shift. A heart beginning to find fulfillment in things other than God, a reliance on worldly sources of security and satisfaction. This idolatry had profound consequences not just for Solomon, but for the nation of Israel. When the king turns away from God, the spiritual health of the kingdom is affected. The first cracks in obedience and devotion spread like ripples, influencing priests, leaders, and the people. The subtle acceptance of foreign gods and practices created a precedent that weakened spiritual clarity and obedience throughout the nation. Solomon's personal compromise became a template that subtly affected the hearts of those under his rule, illustrating the profound impact leadership has on the spiritual direction of a people. Despite his wisdom and insight, Solomon's heart had been ensnared by desires and distractions that clouded judgment. Idolatry was not simply about bowing to foreign gods. It represented a turning of the heart away from the covenant relationship he once cherished. It illustrated the vulnerability of even the most gifted, wise, and devout individuals when pride, distraction, or desire for comfort outweighs consistent obedience. The story of Solomon's decline serves as a mirror, warning believers that no amount of wisdom or blessing can protect the heart from drifting when vigilance wanes. The spiritual lessons in Solomon's idolatry are clear. Even when we are gifted, blessed, and walking in great favor, we must guard our hearts carefully. Compromise often begins subtly, and what seems harmless can grow into patterns that pull us away from God. The decline in Solomon's faith reminds us that intimacy with God requires continual attention, humility, and prioritization above all else. External achievements, human wisdom, or worldly connections cannot replace a heart fully devoted to Jesus. Solomon's final years were overshadowed by this decline. While his name remained associated with wisdom, wealth, and the temple he built, the reality of his spiritual drift was profound. He had the capacity for divine insight, yet his heart's compromises illustrate a truth that transcends history. Blessings and talent do not guarantee spiritual security. The heart must remain vigilant, humble, and fully surrendered, for even the greatest of gifts can be overshadowed by neglect, desire, and the allure of the world. Part 4. Consequences of his choices. The choices Solomon made in turning away from God had consequences that rippled through his life, his family, and the nation of Israel. These were not instantaneous punishments, but gradual, unfolding results of spiritual compromise. God allowed these consequences to serve as lessons, revealing the dangers of turning away from devotion and the importance of maintaining alignment with His will. The most immediate consequence was a gradual distancing from God's favor. While Solomon's wisdom remained remarkable, the intimacy, guidance, and blessings he once enjoyed were diminished as his heart strayed. On a personal level, Solomon's relationships suffered. His foreign wives, once sources of alliance and stability, became influences that drew his heart away from God. Family dynamics became complicated, loyalty was tested, and internal tensions grew. These relationships, which began as strategic and beneficial, became channels for spiritual distraction and division. The seeds of disunity within his household foreshadowed the greater divisions that would later challenge the nation. The consequences extended to Israel itself. Solomon's spiritual drift, his idolatry, and his indulgence in worldly pleasures weakened the spiritual fabric of the kingdom. The people saw their king's choices and were influenced accordingly. His compromises in worship and alliances created a precedent that allowed idolatry and moral compromise to flourish. The unity, peace, and clarity that had characterized his early reign began to fray, planting seeds of division that would erupt after his death. Additionally, God's judgment, though tempered by mercy, was unavoidable. The scriptures record that the kingdom would eventually be divided because of Solomon's disobedience, splitting the tribes of Israel after his death. This division was a direct consequence of choices that prioritized worldly alliances, comfort and desires over steadfast devotion to God. It illustrates a principle that remains relevant. Leadership carries immense responsibility, and spiritual compromise at the top can have far-reaching effects for generations. Solomon also experienced personal regret and the heavy burden of reflection. In his later writings, he recorded the vanity, emptiness, and futility of pursuits that were not aligned with God. His wealth, wisdom, and accomplishments, though extraordinary, could not compensate for the spiritual distance he had allowed to develop in his heart. These reflections serve as both a warning and a lesson. No amount of human achievement can replace a heart fully devoted to God, and choices made in the present shape outcomes for the future. The consequences of Solomon's choices remind us that wisdom and blessing do not protect the heart from spiritual decline. Even the wisest can falter, and even the most blessed can experience the weight of compromise. The ripples extend beyond the individual to family, community, and nation. Spiritual decisions are never isolated. They affect all who are connected to us and influence future generations. Solomon's life is a testimony to the intertwined nature of personal devotion, leadership responsibility, and the consequences of drifting from God. The sobering reality of Solomon's final days challenges us to reflect on our own lives. Are there areas of compromise, subtle distractions, or misplaced priorities that could distance our hearts from God? His story illustrates that even the greatest wisdom, when not accompanied by humility and unwavering devotion, can lead to regret, spiritual decline, and consequences that extend beyond the individual. The choices Solomon made and their consequences offer enduring lessons for believers today. Guard your heart, remain steadfast, and prioritize intimacy with Jesus above all else. Part 5. Lessons for Believers. Today, the story of Solomon's final days is not just a historical account. It is a mirror for our own lives. Even the wisest and most blessed can falter when the heart drifts from God. Solomon's experiences remind us that wisdom, talent, and success cannot replace intimacy with Jesus. Every believer today can learn from his life the importance of humility, vigilance, and prioritizing God above worldly comforts. Solomon teaches us that spiritual discipline is not optional, but essential, and that constant alignment with God's will is the only safeguard against subtle compromises that can erode even the strongest faith. One of the most profound lessons is the danger of distractions and attachments. Just as Solomon's foreign wives introduced influences that drew his heart away from God, our own lives are filled with potential distractions. Careers, relationships, possessions, and even achievements can subtly shift our focus from Christ if we are not vigilant. The key is discernment, understanding what draws us closer to God and what pulls us away. Prayer, meditation on Scripture, and regular reflection on our priorities keep the heart aligned, preventing gradual drift from the Lord. Another lesson is the danger of pride and self-reliance. Solomon had immense wisdom, yet his heart became susceptible to pride. Similarly, we can easily become enamored with our own knowledge, accomplishments, or influence, believing we can navigate life without constant dependence on Jesus. True wisdom comes not from intellect or experience alone, but from a humble heart that acknowledges God's guidance in every decision. Pride blinds the heart and opens the door to compromise, while humility safeguards devotion and discernment. Solomon's story also illustrates the long-term impact of our choices. His spiritual decline not only affected himself, but also the nation of Israel and the generations that followed. In the same way, our spiritual decisions today ripple outward, impacting family, community, and even society. The choices we make in obedience, love, and devotion can strengthen those around us, while compromise and distraction can create challenges that extend far beyond our own lives. This reminds us to live intentionally, with awareness of the broader consequences of our spiritual alignment. Lastly, Solomon's life underscores the enduring truth of God's mercy and love. Even in his decline, the lessons of his story serve to guide, warn, and instruct. God's desire is not to condemn, but to cultivate hearts that remain devoted and aligned with his will. As believers, we are called to learn from his mistakes, embrace the lessons, and apply them in our own spiritual journey. We are reminded that it is never too late to return to God, to deepen our faith, and to seek a life of integrity, humility, and devotion. Conclusion. The life and final days of King Solomon are both inspiring and cautionary. His wisdom, wealth, and accomplishments remain unparalleled, yet his spiritual decline and eventual sadness reveal the fragility of the human heart when devotion wanes. Solomon's story teaches us that true success is not measured by achievements, accolades, or knowledge alone, but by the alignment of the heart with God. Even the wisest can stumble, and even the most blessed can experience consequences if their hearts drift from obedience. For believers today, Solomon's life is a call to vigilance, humility, and continual devotion. It challenges us to examine our priorities, guard against distractions and pride, and maintain an intimate relationship with Jesus above all else. His story reminds us that spiritual discipline, discernment, and faithful living are essential to walking securely in God's plan. The glory and wisdom Solomon experienced can inspire us, but his decline serves as a warning, a reminder that the heart must remain devoted, vigilant, and aligned with God's will. Let us take to heart the lessons of Solomon's last days. Pursue wisdom with humility, cherish intimacy with Jesus, remain steadfast in obedience, and recognize the subtle dangers that can erode faith over time. By doing so, we can walk faithfully in our own journey, avoiding the pitfalls of compromise and living a life that reflects true devotion and alignment with God. Solomon's life is a timeless testimony, a story of blessing, brilliance, and the enduring need for a heart fully devoted to Jesus. May we learn, apply, and be strengthened by his story, living faithfully until the day we meet our Savior.